You wake to the sound of retching. Not yours, though that will come soon enough. The chamber pot beside your bed emits a foul odor, and the smell makes your empty stomach clench like a fist. Your sheets are soaked through with sweat and unpleasant odors. You try to sit up, but your limbs shake with the effort, muscles now barely able to support your weight. The physicians whisper outside your door, their voices carrying through wood that's been warped by years of your body's foul odors. They speak of miasmas and evil humors, of divine punishment and astrological misalignment. None of them speak the truth that's literally eating you alive from within. That your own filth, your long-standing refusal to bathe, your proud declaration that water never touched royal skin, has turned your body into a breeding ground for serious illness. You are King James VI of Scotland, soon to be James I of England, and you're dying by degrees of your own making, not from poison or plague or the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, but from a lifetime of accumulated grime that's transformed your royal person into a walking pestilence. Your courtiers call it divine affliction, your enemies whisper of witchcraft. But the truth is far more grotesque and entirely self-inflicted. You haven't properly washed your hands in 20 years. You haven't bathed your body in longer than anyone can remember. And now, as infection spreads through wounds that won't heal, as parasites infest your unwashed skin, as diseases that your own waste has cultivated ravage your organs, you're learning that even kings can't escape the consequences of their own repugnance. To understand how a king could become a monument to his own filth, we must first understand the man who would unite the crowns of Scotland and England under a banner of intellectual brilliance and physical revulsion. James wasn't born disgusting. As a child in Scotland, separated from his mother Mary, Queen of Scots, when he was barely a year old, he was bathed regularly by nurses who understood that cleanliness, even in the 16th century, had some connection to health. But somewhere in his traumatic childhood, between the political murders he witnessed and the harsh Presbyterian education that shaped his mind, something fundamental broke in his relationship with his own body. The scholars who raised him after his mother's imprisonment taught him Latin, Greek, theology, and philosophy. They shaped him into one of the most educated monarchs in European history, a king who would write treatises on everything from witchcraft to the divine right of kings. But they also instilled in him a profound disconnection from physical reality, a belief that the mind's pursuits were noble while the body's needs were base and shameful. This philosophical framework would transform into something far more disturbing as James matured, a complete rejection of basic hygiene that he would elevate to the level of royal doctrine. By the time James assumed personal rule of Scotland at age 17, his aversion to washing had already become noticeable. Courtiers described the young king's hands as perpetually stained with grime, his fingernails heavily soiled. He would eat elaborate banquets with fingers that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, tearing into meat while dirt fell onto his plate. When questioned about his habits, James would laugh and declare that he was too busy with matters of state to waste time on such trivial concerns as washing. But those close to him noticed how he would flinch when anyone suggested he might benefit from a bath, how his eyes would darken with something between fear and rage at the mere mention of water touching his skin. The truth was that James had developed what modern medicine would recognize as a severe phobia, specifically ablutophobia, the fear of washing, bathing, or cleaning. But in the 16th century, there was no framework for understanding such conditions. Instead, James's refusal to wash became entangled with his complex beliefs about kingship, divinity, and the nature of royal bodies. He began to argue that kings were fundamentally different from common men, that their bodies were sacred vessels that shouldn't be subjected to the same base maintenance as ordinary flesh. Water, he claimed, would wash away the divine oils that God had placed upon his royal person. To bathe would be to diminish his connection to the Almighty, to reduce himself to the level of common humanity. This wasn't mere eccentricity or philosophical abstraction. James genuinely believed that his unwashed state was a form of preservation, that the accumulated layers of his own excretions formed a kind of protective barrier between his divine essence and the corrupting influence of the mundane world. He would spend hours writing theological justifications for his filth, citing obscure biblical passages about holy men who lived in the wilderness without washing, drawing parallels between his own grimy state and the sanctified dirt of martyrs and saints. When James married Anne of Denmark in 1589, the young queen was horrified by her husband's hygiene. Royal marriages were always political arrangements, but most princes at least attempted to make themselves presentable for their brides. James arrived at his wedding ceremony with fingernails so long and dirty that they resembled talons, with hair that was unkempt and greasy, with breath with an overpowering odor. Anne, raised in the relatively hygienic Danish court, initially tried to encourage her husband toward cleanliness. She had special soaps imported from France, arranged for heated baths scented with herbs and oils, even attempted to make washing a romantic activity they could share. James's response was violent revulsion. He accused his wife of trying to weaken him, of attempting to strip away his royal protection, of participating in a conspiracy to make him vulnerable to his enemies. The marriage bed became a battlefield where Anne's disgust met James's defiance, where the young queen would weep at the smell of her husband while he claimed his odor was a sign of sovereignty. After their first few children were born, Anne essentially separated from James, maintaining her own chambers far from his putrid presence, appearing with him only for essential state functions where she would breathe through perfumed handkerchiefs and stand as far from him as protocol allowed. But James's filth wasn't merely personal. It became a matter of state, a defining characteristic of his court that affected everyone who came into contact with him. Ambassadors would return to their home countries with tales of the Scottish king whose throne room smelled extremely unpleasant, whose touch left visible residue on documents, whose presence could clear a room faster than an announcement of plague. The French ambassador wrote to his king that negotiating with James was like treating with a creature that had crawled from a sewer and claimed divine right to rule. The Spanish envoy reported that he had to burn his clothes after each audience, so deeply had James's stench penetrated the fabric. The move to England in 1603, when James inherited the English throne from Elizabeth I, should have been an opportunity for transformation. The English court was far wealthier than its Scottish counterpart, with elaborate bathing facilities, armies of servants dedicated to maintaining hygiene, and a culture that, while not obsessed with cleanliness by modern standards, at least recognized washing as a social necessity. But James brought his filth with him like a conquering army, transforming the pristine palaces of England into monuments to his own decay. Whitehall Palace, which had gleamed under Elizabeth's fastidious management, became a maze of stench and squalor under James's rule. The king ordered that the palace's numerous bathing rooms be converted to other purposes, declaring that water fixtures were invitations to moral weakness. He surrounded himself with courtiers who either shared his aversion to washing or were willing to pretend they did to gain his favor. The Duke of Buckingham, James's infamous favorite, learned to coat himself in perfume so strong they could compete with the king's stench, creating an overpowering mix of odors that made court gatherings nearly unbearable. The physical manifestations of James's hygiene grew more grotesque with each passing year. His skin developed a permanent grayish cast from the accumulated dirt, with patches that had hardened on his skin. Sores that should have healed in days lingered for months, feeding on the bacteria that thrived in his unwashed flesh. His teeth, never cleaned, deteriorated severely over time until eating became an ordeal of careful positioning and patient chewing. His tongue, coated with buildup, had lost most of its ability to taste, requiring foods to be increasingly spiced and seasoned for him to detect any flavor at all. The medical consequences were predictable but spectacular in their variety. James suffered from chronic skin infections that would have been easily treatable with basic washing. Painful swellings appeared on his body, lasting far longer than they should have and often forcing him to discard clothing. Persistent infestations took hold, far beyond what was typical even for that era, creating unusual health problems. Physicians documented unusual infestations in his unwashed skin, colonies of organisms that had evolved specifically to thrive in the unique ecosystem of the king's body. His digestive system, constantly exposed to the bacteria from his filthy hands, existed in a state of perpetual crisis. He suffered from chronic digestive problems, which he often blamed on poison plots rather than his habit of eating with unwashed hands. Attendants noted that these ailments left him weakened and in constant discomfort. Yet James wasn't merely passive in his filth. He actively cultivated it, developing rituals and habits that ensured his body would achieve new heights of repugnance. He refused to change his clothing until garments fell apart from extreme wear. His favorite doublet, which he wore for state occasions, was so stiff with accumulated bodily fluids that it could stand on its own when removed. He would pick at his sores and boils obsessively, then examine the extracted matter with the fascination of a scholar studying rare texts. He kept collections of his own skin and nail remnants, which he claimed had medicinal properties due to their royal origin. The king's bedchamber became a particular source of horror for those forced to enter it. James refused to allow his sheets to be changed regularly, insisting that the accumulated sweat and grime created a comfortable patina that helped him sleep. The mattress, never aired or cleaned, developed its own presence of insects and organisms that servants could hear moving within the fabric. The smell was so overpowering that even hardened courtiers would vomit upon entering, requiring them to build up tolerance through repeated exposure like soldiers adapting to battlefield conditions. James's personal relationships, already controversial due to his preference for male favorites, were further complicated by his hygiene. Contemporaries later recorded that close proximity to the king could be extremely unpleasant. His favorite, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, reportedly demanded extraordinary sums to maintain his position close to the king. Some historians suggest that James's physical repulsiveness served as a form of protection, ensuring that only those truly desperate for power would consent to proximity with the royal person. The intellectual gymnastics James performed to justify his condition grew more elaborate as his health deteriorated. He wrote treatises arguing against washing, that true holiness was demonstrated through acceptance of the body's natural state. He claimed that his diseases were tests from God, divine trials that proved his special relationship with the Almighty. When courtiers died after prolonged exposure to his presence, he declared they had been insufficiently pure to withstand the holy corruption of royalty. His writings from this period reveal a mind struggling to reconcile obvious physical decay with delusions of divine appointment, creating increasingly bizarre theological frameworks to explain why God's appointed monarch was rotting alive. The political implications of James's condition extended far beyond palace walls. Foreign diplomats began conducting negotiations through intermediaries, refusing to enter the king's presence. Trade agreements were signed with documents passed through multiple hands to avoid James's contaminating touch. Military commanders reported that troops refused to fight for a king they believed was cursed or diseased. The very legitimacy of the monarchy came into question as subjects wondered what kind of God would anoint such a creature as his representative on earth. Parliament developed elaborate protocols to minimize contact with the king while maintaining the pretense of respect. Sessions were scheduled for well-ventilated halls with windows thrown open regardless of weather. Representatives drew lots to determine who would have to approach the throne for direct communication, with those selected often fasting beforehand to reduce the chance of vomiting in the royal presence. The Speaker of the House kept a box of strong-smelling herbs that he would periodically sniff during royal addresses, a practice that became so common that taking the herbs became court slang for enduring something unbearable. As James aged, his condition transformed from merely repulsive to actively life-threatening. The infections that his body had somehow fought off for decades began to overwhelm his weakened immune system. Gangrene set in where chronic sores had destroyed circulation. His kidneys, poisoned by decades of self-contamination, began to fail. Blood poisoning became a constant threat as any minor injury would immediately become infected in the bacterial paradise of his unwashed flesh. Physicians called to treat him would recoil at the sight of wounds that looked like they belonged on a weeks-old corpse rather than a living monarch. The king's final years were a descent into a hell of his own making. In his later years he became unable to walk, weakened by chronic infections, and had to be carried between rooms on a litter. His hands, gnarled with arthritis exacerbated by chronic infection, could no longer hold the pen he had once used to write his elaborate treatises. His mind, poisoned by the toxins his failing body could no longer filter, began to slip into delirium where he would hold conversations with invisible courtiers and issue proclamations to long-dead subjects. The death of King James in 1625 was less a singular event than the culmination of a decades-long process of self-destruction. His final days were spent in agony that no amount of wine or primitive painkillers could dull. His body, so long a temple to his own twisted philosophy of divine filth, finally collapsed under the weight of its accumulated corruptions. The official cause of death was listed as tertian ague, a form of malaria, but the physicians who performed the autopsy reported finding a body so unhealthy that determining a single cause of death was impossible. His organs were affected by parasites, his blood was severely infected, his bones were weakened by infection. One physician wrote privately that he had never seen a body in such poor condition at the time of death. The aftermath of James's death revealed the full extent of his impact on those around him. Servants who had attended him closely showed signs of chronic illness from prolonged exposure to his diseases. Several courtiers who had been forced into close contact with the king died within months of his passing, their immune systems finally collapsing after years of assault. The palaces where he had lived required extensive renovation, with some rooms so contaminated they had to be sealed permanently. Workers cleaning out his personal chambers reported finding unique colonies of insects, species that had evolved specifically to live in the unique environment of royal filth. Yet perhaps the most disturbing legacy of James's reign was the normalization of his repugnance among certain segments of the court. A generation of courtiers had grown up believing that hygiene was considered unnecessary, that true nobility was demonstrated through the ability to transcend physical discomfort. Some continued to practice ritualistic uncleanliness even after James's death, forming a bizarre sect that believed washing was a form of spiritual corruption. These Jacobean purists would maintain their founders' practices for decades, creating pockets of deliberate filth in otherwise increasingly hygienic society. The historical impact of James's condition extends beyond the merely grotesque into questions about power, mental illness, and the dangers of absolute authority. Here was a man whose obvious mental illness, his phobia of washing, was transformed through the alchemy of royal prerogative into state policy. His courtiers, who could have insisted on basic hygiene, instead enabled and even celebrated his decay because their positions depended on his favor. The entire apparatus of government became complicit in maintaining the fiction that the king's filth was a form of holiness rather than what it obviously was, a severe psychiatric condition that happened to afflict someone with unlimited power. Modern historians studying James's reign have identified patterns that resonate with contemporary understanding of power and dysfunction. The way his court adapted to and normalized his extreme behavior mirrors how institutions can become corrupted when leaders with severe psychological issues are allowed to operate without constraint. The elaborate theological justifications James created for his condition demonstrate how ideology can be twisted to support even the most obviously destructive behaviors when those behaviors come from positions of authority. The medical professionals of James's time, limited by their understanding but not by their powers of observation, left detailed records that allow modern physicians to diagnose conditions that went untreated for decades. Beyond the obvious infections and parasitic infestations, James likely suffered from numerous autoimmune conditions triggered by chronic exposure to his own waste products. His mental deterioration in later years shows signs of metabolic encephalopathy, where toxins that should have been filtered by functioning kidneys instead poisoned his brain. The chronic pain from his various conditions would have created a feedback loop of suffering that made rational thought increasingly difficult. What makes James' story particularly tragic is that it was entirely preventable. Simple washing, the most basic of human maintenance, would have prevented virtually all of his suffering. But his mind, twisted by trauma and reinforced by unlimited power, transformed this simple act into an impossibility. He died as he lived, a victim of his own delusions, surrounded by courtiers who had long since stopped seeing him as human and regarded him instead as a grotesque force of nature that had to be endured until it finally consumed itself. The recovery of the English court after James's death was gradual but dramatic. His son, Charles I, obsessed with dignity and presentation, immediately instituted strict hygiene requirements for all courtiers. Bathing facilities that James had demolished were rebuilt and expanded. Perfumers and soap makers who had seen their businesses decline during James's reign suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with orders. The court that had reeked of decay transformed almost overnight into one that gleamed with cleanliness, as if trying to wash away the memory of what it had endured. But the psychological scars remained for those who had lived through James's reign. Courtiers who had spent years in his presence reported nightmares about the smell, phantom odors that would strike them years later. Servants who had attended to his personal needs required what we would now recognize as trauma counseling, though no such framework existed at the time. Some never recovered from what they had witnessed and endured, living the rest of their lives with the knowledge of how low human dignity could sink when power and madness intertwined. The tragedy of King James VI and I serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the human capacity for normalization of the abnormal. A king who never washed his hands became a king whose entire body rebelled against its own existence, whose palace became a monument to decay, whose legacy includes not just the King James Bible and the union of Scottish and English crowns, but also the specter of what happens when mental illness meets absolute power. His story reminds us that civilization is more fragile than we imagine, that the distance between order and chaos can be measured in something as simple as soap and water, and that even kings, especially kings, are subject to the basic laws of biology that govern all human flesh. In the end, James's divine right to rule could not protect him from the microscopic subjects that truly governed his body. The bacteria, parasites, and infections that thrived in his unwashed flesh recognized no royal prerogative. They consumed him with the same indifference they would show to any host who provided such ideal conditions for their proliferation. The king, who believed himself above the basic requirements of human hygiene, died as evidence that no amount of power, wealth, or theological justification can exempt anyone from the fundamental realities of physical existence. His death stood as final proof that even those who claim divine appointment must eventually answer to the same natural laws that govern all mortal life.